This is the I Read Comic Books podcast. I'm Kara Szymborski here with Nick White, and today we're going to do something a little bit different because longtime listeners of this show will know that Nick and I have kind of a reputation in that Nick is quote-unquote the Valiant guy, and I am quote-unquote the Archie guy. So for this episode, we decided to swap fandoms. Nick picked a book that he felt was representative of Valiant for me, a newbie to Valiant, and I picked a book that I thought was representative of Archie comics for Nick to read, and we're going to discuss. So, Nick, how about you tell our fabulous listeners which book you picked for me to read?
Yeah, so the book I picked is Bloodshot Reborn, Volume 1. This came out in 2015. It was a part of what was called, like, the Valiant Next series of titles. Towards the end of 2014, they were making a really big push towards introducing some new books. This was the second of the 6 that rolled out. The first was The Valiant by Matt Kindt and Jeff Lemire with art by Paolo Rivera. And this book, Bloodshot Reborn, is meant to basically roll out of The Valiant and sort of basically give people who were new to Bloodshot or were looking for a new entry point to have a new series to follow. And I think they were also trying to give people who are into Jeff Lemire sort of an opportunity to pick up a Jeff Lemire book. And so it's written by Jeff Lemire, obviously, with art primarily and largely by Miko Sueyan, except for the 5th issue, which was drawn by Raul Allen and Patricia Martin. So, yes, that was the book I picked.
So I had gone into this book with a very limited knowledge of the Valiant universe. I had read some stuff like many, many years ago, like 5 or 6 years ago at this point. So I didn't really know a lot about it. I think I had read, was there a book called Divinity or something like that?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. Divinity.
Okay. Mm-hmm. I think I had read that one and liked it. And I had read some of the Faith stuff and when that first came out. But I don't really know anything about the universe. So going into this Bloodshot book, I have to admit, I did have a slight leg up on the exposition in the beginning explaining the concept of Bloodshot because I had just watched the Bloodshot movie.
Right, and that was my hope. That was kind of both in picking this book for you and also sort of looking at this as an opportunity for our listeners to maybe have their own introduction to Valiant. I figured something linked to the movie would be a pretty smart way of navigating that. So that was what informed that. So
okay, all right. So reading this book was interesting for me because it's not the kind of book I would have chosen to read because it's very just guns solve all your problems. And that is not the kind of media that I normally gravitate towards. And I was also annoyed because like I said, I have a very limited experience with Valiant, but I know enough to know that Bloodshot's ex-girlfriend, I guess. I remember that I had read something in which I said, oh, I like that character. So I was very disappointed to start reading this book only to find out that she's dead. And that was not a great starting place for me.
Oh, you mean K the Geomancer.
Yeah, that one.
Right, so...
I mean, spoilers for anyone who doesn't know anything about Valiant, but they do start the book by saying she's dead, and you're like, what? So
yeah, and I get your disappointment in terms of that, and yet I also would temper that by saying, ooh, how do I tiptoe this real hard? this is comics, and if there was one rule that's consistent about superhero comics, I want everyone to think about that rule just for a moment or two.
All right.
And I won't say any more, but I think maybe you're picking up what I'm putting down.
Oh my god, okay.
Is that fair? Do you
We get it, Nick. We get it. All right. So this book, like you said, is very much like, we're going to do some heavy Bloodshot exposition while still showing you a new story, which I did appreciate, because within the first 4 pages, I knew what kind of character I was dealing with. Heavy shades of the Punisher, Nick, I gotta say. Heavy shades. Heavy
That's
shades.
Fair.
But like that said, that meant that because I have seen part of the Punisher on Netflix, because I am a true and proper comic nerd who only ever reads the comics, I kind of like knew the kind of trope of what I was getting to, of like, oh, I'm terrible and I killed people, but now I'm rethinking my actions and might want to have a different path forward. I'm like, all right,
maybe those actions had consequences, right? Exactly.
Consequences, but also guns are still the answer, because this is what I know. And I'm like, oh god, okay, fine. But
sorry, go ahead.
That's okay. But there were a few moments like that I felt approached this kind of uniquely American macho man devoid of feelings journey, or like not in touch with your feelings journey, that we do see in a lot of action or superhero comics, that I thought were like realistic or borderline subversive enough that I kept being interested. For example, there's this part where Bloodshot is, because like the story starts with you finding out that Bloodshot used to be like super like strong and fast and tough and like indestructible because of these nanites in his bloodstream, because comic books. And at the start of this book, he does not have the nanites, but he used to. So he's kind of dealing with being human for him the first time, because he does not remember his life before Bloodshot. But he actually is given the space in the narration to cope with that. Like, the part that really struck me is when he is he's like battling this other like super jacked person, and he realizes that he is not as strong as he's used to being, and he has kind of like actively let himself go. And as someone who used to do CrossFit, I felt that because like having muscles and not having muscles are two extremely different things and give you very different abilities. And I'm not gonna lie, y'all, Pandemic Kara has not left the couch except to take a walk. So when he was like, oh, my muscles are not like, it's like swimming, everything hurts. And I'm like, man, this is like the realest I have ever seen a superhero book be.
Yeah, and I think what you're kind of getting at, and I think what really appealed to me about this book, is that I've also read the Bloodshot book, Dwayne Swarensky's run, which launched in 2012 along with the Valiant relaunch. And that was very much, it wasn't a bad book, and you knew what you were getting into, but that was very much just what you would kind of expect from an action book. And in a lot of ways, that was also what people wanted, because that was also what the 90s version of Bloodshot was. And so what I really like about Lemire's run, and you see some of that in this volume, I think you certainly see more of it as the series goes on, because Lemire was writing this book for maybe 3.5 years, if you count Bloodshot Reborn, Bloodshot, I think it's called Bloodshot New York City, and then Bloodshot Salvation. It's sort of, not to get super serious, because I think some of this people would say, oh, you're reading into it too much, but I think some of it's there. I find it an interesting take from an outsider, Lemire being Canadian, kind of an outsider perspective on violence in America, and sort of how violence permeates American culture. Not to get this controversial, but
it does. So
yes, when you look
really
at how easy it is, right? When you look at how easy it is for him to acquire firearms, and it's a passing moment in the comic. I think it's meant to be sort of a glib joke, but it's there. And when they talk about the initial tragedy being the shooting up of a movie theater in Colorado, right? This book was written in knowing how much Lemire tends to write things way in advance of when they come out. He was probably writing that issue in like 2014, maybe even 2013. So only a year or two after that tragedy in Colorado. So there's definitely some hard to miss parallels with sort of tragic moments in America's history.
Right.
And so sometimes they verge a little bit on being on the nose, but I think a lot of this book kind of struggles with how do we deal with kind of this cultural obsession with violence, whether it's being presented as this disease, right? Like literally this like disease that's transforming people, or even looking at the kid that he's interacting with at the hotel, who is obsessed with all this violent stuff. And we're not going to go down the whole like violent video games make people violent or whatever. I realized Lemire was trying to just do some quick shorthand about just how people are inundated with violence and all forms of pop culture, and whether or not those things are influencing people. Again, I don't want to make any claims there, and certainly people much more qualified have. But yeah, I don't know. I think I sort of fell down a rabbit hole of sort of analyzing this book as Lemire attempting to present a action narrative comic, but also make some interesting commentary on American culture and its interactions with violence. I don't know.
Well, you definitely don't say I don't know after doing an in-depth analysis.
Anyway, here's my 30-page thesis. Take it or leave it.
Okay. So I have some additional thoughts about this book. One, I did not appreciate that every female character, any attractive female character in the book was called a slut at least once. I did not appreciate that. I understood why it was a choice that was made to illustrate that the person referencing her as a slut was not to be trusted, but I still did not appreciate it and felt that it was lazy writing. Also, the blood squirt hallucination. That
right,
is
the one
like,
drawn by Jeff Lemire. That was his artwork the whole time.
Oh, okay. Was not expecting a total Batmite character to show up, but it worked. So okay, because it's very like this like totally out of place cartoon sidekick is basically harassing Bloodshot the entire time, but it kind of works because he's fucked up. And of course, he would be hallucinating, or maybe it's the nanites talking. And
perfect! I love that. I love that. It's like because he does such a good job of riding the line, at least for me, where I'm just constantly like, "Is it real? Is it not real?" Like, there's even a moment where you see him coming out of the gun store, right? And he's carrying that little case of fireworks, right? And you're like, "Oh, this is all made up." But if you look, there's another shot later where they show the van parked. And the fireworks are on top. So it's like,
what is reality? Ooh.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Also, speaking of recurring themes that longtime listeners will know about, the artwork was not really vibing with it. Don't generally like artwork like that. Yeah. I just kind of like, oh, you're here to service the story. There were a couple panels, especially I think during fight scenes, where it actually did feel, though, that even though the characters were, like, really muscle-bound, it wasn't, like, a cartoony muscle-boundness. Like, it felt grounded enough in reality where, like, it seemed realistic, like, that those muscles would have that heft to it. They didn't feel as flat as some other superhero muscles. I don't know. That was just, like, a weird detail that I noticed. But the last chapter in this volume, the artwork completely changed, and I was like, oh, I like this. Why wasn't the whole volume this?
Yes. So I totally get this. I agree with you 100%. Miko Suwayan, who drew the first 4 issues, it's a very detailed style. It's sort of, if you have like the stylized versus realism spectrum, like this, his style starts to lean more towards Alex Ross, right? It starts to verge towards photorealism. And for me, I don't really love that. So I'm totally right there with you. I think it's a technically solid style that I think brings in people who like superhero muscly books, right? I agree with you. I think there's a more realism to the muscle. Totally not always my thing. As for the last issue, Raoul Allen and Patricia Martin are top 5, at least top 10 of my all-time favorite artists. Well, so I totally get you.
I mean,
it's so good.
It's more dreamy and painterly, especially with the color choices. So I just felt like when I got to the last chapter in this volume, that the hallucinations that Bloodshot's may be happening made more sense, because all of reality felt a little dreamlike with that style.
Yeah, if you like that art, those two are the ones that drew Secret Weapons, the book I can never shut up about and, recommended for a bunch of things. They drew Secret Weapons. They did Wrath of the Eternal Warrior. They're so good. They're so good. I love their art a bunch. And the one thing I do want to mention about this book, and you probably noticed this too, is that I think with like DC, with Marvel, with other studios, the reason that you see a lot of artist changes, especially within the same run, especially within the same issue, is it's generally about meeting deadlines, right? You're putting a second colorist on the book because this book comes out in 2 weeks. You're putting an extra penciler on this book because the main penciler isn't keeping up. Like, they're not style choices. They're time-based choices. And so what I really love about this book is you see the fact that, and I don't know if it's as true within the last year and a half, but Valiant makes those sorts of decisions deliberately as a style choice. And so, like, having Lemire draw Bloodsquirt, like, would you see a choice like that made at DC or Marvel? I'm not so sure you would.
Think of the IP value, Nick. You have to protect
exactly.
the IP.
Exactly. And then like having the last issue be a dreamy sort of one, and you bring in this artist who really well matches that, like, would you see that at a big 2 book? I don't know if you would have the producers or the editors say, for the last issue of this arc, we're going to bring in somebody different because the issue is going to be a dreamscape. I don't know if you would have those choices being made. So, yeah.
All right. So, overall, like I said, this is not a book I would have read had you not given it to me to read for homework. But by the time I got to the end of it, I was interested to read more, even though I wasn't necessarily comfortable with the subject matter, since it is very shoot 'em up. But I was curious, and I appreciated that there were enough references to other Valiant stuff where I was like intrigued but didn't get mad at not knowing what those references were. I was just like, oh, this is part of a bigger world, maybe I should know more about that bigger world. And like, because I had read a couple things a million years ago when, for example, Bloodsquirt makes a bunch of references, I knew enough to know that he was making a reference even if I didn't understand the full reference, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, that last issue is like, hey, this is Ninjak, this is Livewire. And I'm like, I don't know how Kara's gonna feel about this.
I was like, oh, those must be...
Oh, no!
Even if I didn't know the characters, like, I knew Ninjak because I feel like any property that has a white dude cosplaying as a ninja, like, everyone knows who that is. Like, Snake Eyes is everyone's favorite G.I. Joe character. Like, that's just a thing that it just becomes part of your knowledge. But, like, I've never read a Ninjak book, but I'm like, the white dude who is a ninja cosplay.
Right. I've seen this trope. Yeah,
right. So, and then the other characters, I was like, oh, clearly these are other characters who are Valiant superheroes who are being referenced. And if I was a Valiant fan, I'm sure I would be tickled.
Yeah, yeah. Livewire is so cool. I might have to. I would definitely encourage you to read Secret Weapons because Livewire is a big part of that, and she is awesome. So.
We're back to Secret Weapons, Nick. You're right. You can't stop.
I can't stop. Like it was my book for Goodreads last year, and not to pat myself on the back, but everybody who read that book, nothing but good things to say about it. So
okay.
And then I decided that I was going to just keep pushing this in a self-destructive fashion. So this year it was an Aliens book, and I don't know how I'm going to pick a more slightly more polarizing book next year, but we'll see.
I'm sure you'll find a way.
Yeah, exactly. Life finds a way. So, yeah.
All right. So, in an unexpectedly complete 180 from your homework for me.
That's fair.
While I was reading this Bloodshot pick, I was like, damn, we really could not have picked more opposite subject matters for this episode if we tried. So for you, because I grew up reading Archie comics, I actually worked there for a few months after college, and I continue to appreciate their product and the risks that they're able to take as a family-owned company as opposed to a subdivision of a much larger company. And it's so interesting for me revisiting Archie comics as an adult because the more you think about them, the weirder they are, because it is stories about teenagers written by adults for children. And when you think of it like that, you realize that in no way would these ever be realistic representations of anybody. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So my homework for you was to read Archie 75th Anniversary Digest #2. And you might be thinking, why #2? And the answer is because the Archie 75th Anniversary Digest series was a series of like shorter anthologies that Archie Comics printed up to celebrate their 75th anniversary. And I read volume 1, but was really confused by the stories they chose to be in that #1. It was like really heavy on a couple decades and nothing from other decades, and like at least 40 pages about pets. And I was like, Nick will murder me if I make him read 40 pages about the Archie Comics characters and their pets.
I mean, no, probably not. I mean,
but #2 had a lot more. Like, the interesting thing about reading so many Archie comics for me growing up was that they are really because they went for so many decades doing the same tropes over and over again, but with different, like, window dressing, essentially. It was kind of a way to osmose cultural changes happening in the US through this weird lens of Archie comics. So I always appreciated that about them. And so Anniversary Digest #2 had a full range of stories from the 1940s through the 2010s. And it had a lot of stories drawn by Harry Lucy, who is one of the best, like, conveying action illustrators, I think, of the 20th century. Don't at me. That's just a fact. So I will stop talking. And Nick, why don't you share your thoughts of having to read 200 pages of Archie comics for this?
Yeah, that's fair. Where to begin? Geez. from the last topic, I'm just going to sneak this in because I want to make sure I was completely clear on this. I don't want to jump back to this for too long, but I do not want anyone getting the wrong idea, okay? I don't think, based on the research, I don't think video games make people violent, so I don't want the video game people coming
Nick,
after me, okay?
Nobody was still thinking that.
Well, I was. All right. I don't want those people mad at me. Anyway, let's talk about another hot spot for violence, which is Archie comics. So maybe video games don't make people violent. After having read Archie, maybe a case can be made for this. No, I'm just kidding. I think like the biggest TLDR takeaway from all of these stories would be, and it makes sense because Archie's been around for so long, but like the big takeaway for me was, wow, we can pretty much go anywhere and pretty much do anything with this, and we have. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I think people look at something like Superman and they're like, oh, Superman's been around for a really long time, so how do we make things fresh? And I think people struggle with that. I think Archie's been like, dude, this is about normal people. We can do whatever the fuck we want. Mm-hmm. And they have. Having a whole story where a cat is like, hey, let me make some rules for you. Cats could talk to kids. If you're wondering why I haven't up until this point, it's because I haven't wanted to. This is the last day when I can talk to these kids before you're too old to understand me. So now it started to like feel like the Polar Express, where like the bell doesn't ring for you when you get too old. And I was like, this story's gonna make me fucking sad, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And then at the end they're like, yeah, cats don't have feelings. And then the last panel is the cat crying, and I'm like, I hate Kara so much at this point. Like, so that was so sad.
So that was a little Archie story. To clarify what
yes, it needs it. Yeah, please clarify.
To clarify what Nick was saying. So Archie comics have been essentially doing different versions of the same stories for 75 years. Archie Comics president Mike Pellerito said something, I don't have a citation, but he said something like, there are only 5 basic Archie stories, and they just keep redoing them, which is true. Not necessarily a bad thing, because sometimes you just want to watch Archie make 2 dates at the same time and have to figure out how to have both dates at the same time, you know? So something that they did in the, I want to say 60s, 70s, was the Little Archie series, which was envisioning Archie and all his friends as kids in Riverdale. And those stories were kind of dreamy at points, like very philosophical.
Visually, yeah.
Very weird. Like, they met aliens, they met monsters, there was like a mad scientist down the road. Like, anything could happen in the Little Archie books, and it just kind of worked because it was kind of like this weird pseudo-idealized version of childhood where these very profound things happened, like this story in this collection about Caramel, Betty's cat, who's just like telling her life story to little Betty and little Veronica, and then you just want to curl up under your covers and never reemerge. So
I mean, oh god, what a fucking crazy departure that was. Especially even like aesthetically speaking, obviously with a lot of these stories you could tell, and it makes sense that there is a very strong house style for Archie. But this was very different. And I really, really enjoyed that. I also never thought that this book would kick off with it's a Frank Doyle story drawn by Harry Lucy. That has Archie as a DJ who gets enmeshed in a payola scandal. I never thought I would write that in my notebook. It was kind of one of those, like, if you have enough, like, monkeys in front of typewriters, you'll eventually get Shakespeare moments where it was like, I guess with all the letters in the alphabet and all the words I could string together, this would happen eventually. I'm just shocked it happened now. So yeah, you have this story where Archie is like the after-school dance DJ, and people are like thinking that Archie is like the pathway to stardom.
Even though he's only spinning in like the cafeteria, gymnasium.
Oh my god, it's crazy, and the editorial notes, which I always appreciate really well organized collections of comics, and with this, before every story, you have a synopsis, you have a credits page. Typically, they talk to someone like a celebrity like Stan Lee or Stephen King, and they've got a quote to weigh in on it. I really like that stuff as kind of a primer, especially as someone who's not well versed in these things. So it's helpful to have that sort of context of saying like, oh, this was us trying to talk about the payola scandals of the time that were going on in music. So that was kind of crazy. You could also tell that it was not a modern story from the fact that you have the principal calling Archie's dad to come down to the school and kick Archie's ass on school property.
Yeah.
Which, again, that was very much a moment where it's like, put this in the things that would not happen now column.
Uh-huh.
Which, as you go through these stories, there are definitely
there's a lot of that
moments. Yeah, definitely other times. But I mean, you end up at the end of the story. Spoilers for a small 1960s Archie's comic. I'm sure there's one person out there who's going to be very disappointed. He accidentally bumps the recorder when his dad is kicking his ass. And the recording of him getting beat up.
He's not getting beat up, Nick. He's getting spanked. His dad brought the brush to spank him with the brush. I was like, what is happening? But that used to be like socially acceptable.
Right. So that gets recorded and put to music and becomes a new dance craze. And as disturbing as it was that Archie got beat up on school grounds by his dad, the ending was actually disturbingly clever. I was like, that's interesting.
But also remixes of people like in like just saying stuff or like in fights or whatever, getting remixed to music is something that still happens just with the internet now.
Right. As I wrote in my notes here, I put, it's a morally questionable example of music sampling. Yes. So,
sure.
And you're right. It still happens to this day. So, I also have some questions that might reflect just truly how little I know about Archie. So I think you'll love these, and I'm sure that some people at home will have their eyes rolling back. I mean, I'm sorry, you're probably going to have to go to urgent care, but your eyes are going to roll back real far into the back of your head on this one. Why does Archie have an R on his sweater? Does he not know that his initials are AA?
R for Riverdale. They live in Riverdale. That's his school spirit. Oh. The real question is, why does Jughead have an S on his sweater? We just don't know.
I mean, what, are you reading all of my questions off of this notebook, or...
I mean, the S is like a comment. They've made jokes throughout the decades about, well, what does the S mean? But
wait, what? This is a joke? I thought I actually came up with a really good theory. This hasn't been resolved.
What's your theory? There are so many theories. What's yours?
Okay, mine is, I feel like this is like a no-brainer, but like Jughead is not his real name. His real name starts with S. And that's what the S is for. Okay,
you're gonna feel real smug because that's my theory, except I actually have more knowledge about this world to be able to back it up with facts. Jughead has an identical twin named Souphead. This is canon.
I was about to say, are we still dealing with your theory, or is this actual...
No, this is canon. Canon. Jughead canonly has a cousin who looks identical to him, whose name is Souphead. Okay. And so my theory is that at some point Jughead and Souphead swapped places permanently, and Jughead wears the S on his sweater to let us know that he's really Souphead. That's my deep cut theory.
That's terrifying. Oh my god.
So, yeah, that's my theory. I appreciated that on the television show Riverdale, Jughead does often wear a shirt with an S on it, and it's never explained. So that was a nice nod from the comics that they didn't have to keep but did.
Okay. I also have a note here. I really liked the story Garbage In, Garbage Out. I think only in Archie would you ever find a multi-part story that just hinges on the fact that Jughead forgot to take out the trash on the right day and is now paying the price for a prolonged period of time. Yeah, I think we can all maybe relate to something akin to that. So, like, I definitely read that story and I was like, yes, I've been here. Like, I've done this. I get this. So
I actually had to read that one twice because I couldn't quite follow the first time I read through how we got from Jughead didn't take out the trash to Jughead is converting the school health nut into occasionally eating some chocolate. But
oh, wait. Yeah, I didn't understand that either. I thought maybe it was like a weird, awkward, like, where like the issues had multiple stories and it didn't get split right for the collection.
I read it again. That's all the same story. So the switch is where Jughead ditches the garbage bags at the neighbor's house, and he's talking about how the neighbors are such health nuts, so he's surprised that they just don't compost everything, and he's like sneering about it. And then the next panel, which is on a different page, which is why it's confusing, is him and Archie in the school cafeteria, and Jughead complaining about how now, because of this neighbor student, everyone in school is a health nut, and it's driving him crazy because he wants everyone to be able to appreciate junk food. So to prove a point, he just eats junk food every day for a week until his body can't take it anymore and he needs vegetables. And they end with like a moral of the story about how moderation is key in everything you eat. And I'm like, this started with Jughead not taking out the trash. Like, what? So yeah.
What else? The Archie and the 40 stories, I wrote, he looks like Alfred E. Newman?
A little bit. So the style from the 40 stories is not, quote unquote, the Archie house style that you think of when you think of Archie. They were drawn by Bob Montana, and the characters look a little lumpy. I'll say it. And in the 50s, when Dan DeCarlo started drawing it, that's where you get kind of the Archie look that the other artists kind of riff off of.
You know what he kind of looks like in the 30s, now that I think about it, is like, we've all seen that terrifying, do you call them puppets? The terrifying puppets from like Ventriloquism Acts.
Oh yeah.
And there's that one that like just makes everyone want to like shit their pants in fear because it's just like, he kind of looks like that one a little bit.
Okay.
So that was it was also really interesting to sort of see like the newspaper strip offerings as well. Mm-hmm. There was some of those in here, which was really fascinating because most of them were a conventional 2x2 grid of panels, and so what you were getting was a lot of like 4-panel beat jokes. And just being a freaking nerd, I guess, I always find that sort of thing fascinating when like people start using panel structure to kind of create a system for how they want to do like the cadence of jokes. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I found that kind of interesting. But, you know, I could go on about panel grids forever, so that sort of stuff is always kind of fascinating. The modeling picture story, I don't remember the name of it, but I also found that one kind of interesting because, first off, again, you have another story where Archie's kind of a little bit of a perv, a little bit. Maybe even a little is not correct, and it's
especially in the first few decades of Archie comics, they are, I think it's kind of like an overexpression of the whole, like, teenagers have hormones things, but, like, the boys are girl crazy, the girls are boy crazy, and there's a lot of dramatic overexpression of those feelings. So, yeah, they're all pervs. Go on.
Right. So, gosh, what is it? He's trying to get pictures taken for, like, a modeling photography contest, I think is what it is.
Who is the most beautiful girl in Riverdale? Send us your photo.
Exactly. And while Archie was maybe not exactly behaving a way that I would consider appropriate, I did find the end, like, I think what helps temper, I guess, some of these stories is that usually in the end Archie gets thwarted, right? Or his ambitions are kind of he's basically put in his place, right? And while that doesn't totally, like, ignore the fact that in my mind he's behaving badly, and when you read the notes at the beginning of most of the stories, there's something that says, like, in highfalutin terms, it says, there's going to be stuff in this story that isn't really, perhaps socially great now. Much like Disney has on a lot of their Disney Plus stuff. I'm just going to make friends left and right here, so we'll rope them into this here too. The fact that Archie generally gets thwarted in most of these tales, and in this picture story, someone's holding a dog in some of the pictures, but you don't really notice it because I thought this was really clever. You see the person holding the dog off to the side, and he's taking the picture from one angle, and then at the end, when you finally see the pictures in the newspaper, the way that the picture is being taken, like, the dog's head ends up superimposed on, like, Betty's body, or like, I think the dog's tail ends up superimposed on Veronica's body, so it looks like she's got, like, a tail, and so everyone basically makes fun of Archie's photos, and he becomes the laughingstock and obviously doesn't win whatever. And so I did find some of the stories, like I said, even though they were a little dated in some ways and maybe not socially, I don't know, the fact that in so many of these, Archie is the fool, Archie's the idiot, and he's the one who, gets put in his place, I think that made some of them a little bit easier to deal with. So
I mean, it's like you said, a lot of these stories not great. I mean, even I was rereading them and I was like, reading these as a grown-up is different. I still like them, but I see the problems now. Like,
right. Oh, sure.
Yeah. Like, but I do think that they were even sometimes, aware of those problems. Or I think a good example of this is the story in this collection where Reggie is obsessed with the, like, kung fu shows on TV. So he's like running around Riverdale High, like, spouting all this, like, pseudo babble that is like a dig at this kind of kung fu show that maybe does a little exploitation about how like, martial arts and Asian practitioners of martial arts are portrayed in American media in the 60s and 70s. So there's, like, it's clear that Reggie's the idiot in this situation, and there's even, like, Archie and one of his friends, Chuck, whose dad is the coach, trying to tell Reggie, like, hey dude, you're doing it wrong, and actually this is, like, a discipline that's supposed to sharpen your, like, mental focus as well as being a way to protect yourself. And Reggie, like, doesn't want to hear it, and he's just, like, running off making weird, like, hi-ya sounds, and you're like, oh, I see. Vague cultural commentary. Still not, the best modern story the way that they would have done it, but for the time, probably borderline progressive in its way.
Right, and I sort of liken that as well to the story where like Archie is leaving Spanish class, and I don't remember what it is, but his classmate says something to him in Spanish. It might be like adios or something like that, and he's like, yeah, we're not in Spanish class anymore. Don't say these things to me. If you want to talk to me in English. And I'm like, wow, this first panel, we are leading off into like a real, like, panel 1 right out of the gate. This is like, what is happening here? And yet the story actually tells a somewhat poignant tale about the fact that maybe learning other languages, interacting with and understanding other cultures, maybe not a bad thing. He finds out that actually knowing some Spanish allows him to help these people who get in an accident, et cetera, et cetera. And I thought that while it was, a little on the nose when you consider when the story was being written and told, stuff like from that era typically does tend to feel a little on the nose, but also two, I think it told a valuable lesson without really like leaning on it super hard, like this is how you should be, and this is a life skill, and see how Archie was wrong, and to think the way he originally did. And for me, that story, as well as some of the others, kind of make me think of sometimes how, like with All in the Family, again, I'm not trying to only go after characters named Archie. It's just a really weird coincidence that comes up. With Archie Bunker, you've got this guy who, he's the main character, and he's maybe not always the best person, but you're not supposed to always like him, right? It's the idea that you're supposed to question the things that he does, or, and in the same way, I think of Archie from Archie Comics as sort of, is he the most like morally upstanding character in these stories? No, and he's not. Is he like a moral paragon of virtue? Not really. But you're supposed to look at some of the things he does with a little bit of skepticism or cynicism, and say like, oh, well, maybe this isn't the way to do things. So I realize that depending upon your mileage of All in the Family, that, I realize that All in the Family is maybe a reference that like a lot of people are going to be like, what the fuck?
Some people will know, Nick.
Yeah. Okay, good.
So,
but yeah, overall, I really liked it. I thought that the way that they were able to preface all of the stories and give me some context, was a really good way to sort of have a clean lead in to a lot of this stuff, because like there's a wide net being cast here. And so yeah, we've got stories with Reversedale, we've got stories with like that present an alternate history of how people ended up on
Earth.
Earth. Yeah, it's like, where can we not go with this? There's a bunch of, one thing I found really weird, there's like a section of like pinups of someone named Katie Keane, and I was like,
all right.
I don't even know who this person is. I hope she's in Archie Comics.
Nick, okay, so Katie Keane never really crossed over with the core Archie gang. She was in another book, and she was a supermodel. And she currently has a show on the CW that just finished season 1. Right, so
why did they put those pictures in the book?
Because she's an Archie character. It's celebrating 75 years of Archie. There was some little Archie in there. There was some Katie Keane in there. You saw a little bit of Sabrina. You very briefly saw Josie and the Pussycats, even if I think they were the junkyard dogs in the Reversedale story. But like there's a little scattering of some other characters.
Yeah, Josie was also in the Archie meets Kiss story, the last story of the bunch, which I thought was kind of fitting, because that sort of for me, like a lot of my interactions and knowledge of Archie involves all of these weird Archie mashup books that have happened, and I think between the fact that we've seen stuff like Archie and the Punisher, Archie and Kiss, Archie in The Predator.
That Archie and Predator book is great, though.
Yeah, well, I like it because you see a company that is willing to take these risks, and also on the same note, not take their own stuff so seriously, right? Not take their own IPs so seriously that they won't do those things. And the fact that there's a little comment from Alex, I don't know how you say this, Alex Segura.
Yeah.
Before the story, and he mentions not only is it crazy that we had Archie meets Kiss, but he says before I wrote that book, I had written one other Archie comic. I think it was a well-received issue, but it was like an online only one-off thing. Mm-hmm. And he said this is what I wanted to do, and they let him do it. And of course, he's gone on. I believe he's the one who wrote what is the horror one with Francavilla?
Afterlife with Archie.
Right. I think isn't that Segura as well? I think who wrote that?
It's Roberto. I can never pronounce his last name, who also does Riverdale. But Alex Segura has done. He also did Archie Meets the Ramones, I think, and he's got his own very successful series of noir detective novels set in Miami. So, and he's writing the new Poe Dameron novel. So,
okay,
yeah. I mean, Archie Meets Kiss was the first, I think, big comic story that he did, but he's done a lot of stuff since.
I was going to say, I thought for some reason that he had also done some of the Archie horror sort of stuff, but maybe I'm now confusing.
It's possible he did, and I don't know it off the top of my head. I know a lot of Archie stuff off the top of my head. That is not one of those things. But
okay.
But yeah, no, I'm glad to hear that you did find some things in the stories that you did like, because while I was rereading it, I was like, oh god, this is not what Nick reads at all. He's gonna be so annoyed. But
oh no, it's no, I found it kind of interesting, and like I said, for me, the fact that they don't seem to have a big problem with sort of having this freedom with their properties is sort of something where I'm, that interests me. So, yeah. And I've read the Predator stuff, and I've read some of, I think I was confusing Alex Segura with writing another, because I've read a few Archie books. I think I was confusing Afterlife with Archie with the fact that I have read his book, The Archies.
Yeah, that might have been it.
Which is the music one. Mm-hmm. And while I was kind of I don't know about this, they then had a crossover with Churches, which took place for 3 issues.
Why not?
And there were a bunch of Churches comic book covers, and I was okay, put me down for all of them. And so yeah, just this freedom reminds me a lot of, I think, a lot of what IDW does with Ninja Turtles, what IDW does with G.I. Joe, where they're you know what? If you have an interesting story, if you are a really different out there artist like Tom Scioli or someone like that, and you feel passionate about this property, let's just make this happen. Let's just do it. And because I think those are often the moments where people who look at franchise books and sort of cynically, or they look at them as sort of attempting to just get their little niche audience, typically of older comic book readers who are I still really love The Shadow or whatever, and so we need to keep giving those people The Shadow. I think it gives those people sort of a moment of saying okay, we can do more with these books, and Archie certainly is doing more with these books. So
plus such a range of content to choose from. There's just so much opportunity for, like you said, picking some really niche stories. When I was trying to figure out what I should make you read, there were so many options. There's a series that Archie does digital only called Pep Digital, I think. And
I saw that, yeah.
And they have everything kind of like grouped by theme, which for me is great because I could really drill down on like my favorite stuff, and it gets real specific real quick. Like there's like a baseball collection because they've done so many, they've like 100 pages plus of just baseball stories. There's like a tennis collection. There's Betty and Veronica on a boat, which I'm going to read because why wouldn't I? And then there's just all these other stories that they've done throughout like the 80s and the 90s especially. They got a little more wacky with their stuff. My favorite one to reference is, of course, Archie's RC Racers, which was a series where the gang just like went and did remote control car races around the country, and it was like a wacky races send up, and they had like villains chasing them.
I mean, I think we all remember like the RC car craze, so,
right? So
yeah,
like,
that's fine.
Stuff like that. There's Archie BC, where it's like Archie and all the gang as like cavemen, which you kind of saw super quickly referenced at the end of that Archie Mars story.
Yeah.
Like that's a series, like a sub-series they had within the Archie comics.
Oh my god.
There's Jughead's Time Police, which was recently like revisited in a new collection, which is very good, where Jughead is a time cop. Because why not? No other context needed. There's Archie 3000, where it's Archie in the year 3000. Like, you know, it's just the characters, as long as the characters stay the same, they can really be plopped down into any scenario and it works.
Yeah, I mean, I think really that's it, right? Is that there are these core kind of rules of interaction or relationships between characters, and as long as those remain the same, then just do whatever you want with it. So, and I think that's kind of, you know, that's what a lot of people want, is they want something that, you know, consumers want something that's, you know, different, but they don't want things to be too different, right? They want the illusion of, gosh, Nick, let's get into psychology here. They want the illusion of change without it actually happening, right? And so,
well, what a perfect way to sum up both of the things that we read this week. Bloodshot Reborn and Archie Anniversary Digest. Like, that is right. The common thread is like, you want to read something that you know, but it's different enough where you're interested and want to keep reading.
But it's different enough where when you explain it to your friends, you get the illusion of being someone who is a more expanded and well-versed. I read different things. Okay. We're all there. I know everyone's thinking to themselves, that's not me, it's you.
So, now that we have expanded our comic book knowledge with this adventure of swapping fandoms, any last thoughts about our reading journey together?
Sure. I mean, I would say, I don't know if I would keep reading wild and kind of like crazy variety collections, but I think, and I'd have to probably talk to you or someone else, like a more focused arc. I think there are definitely some of those out there that I would be interested in, like just based on the ones that I've seen and based on the ones you've talked about. Like a lot of these like quote unquote like why not scenarios to me, like those seem just very appealing, where it's like, we're going to do this and we don't care what anyone else says. And I think the Predator one was the first one for me where I was like my eyes were opened to the fact that Archie Comics of all publishers would be like, you know what? We really don't give a shit. Like, we're going to do some of these things and we don't care what you think. And I love that. So.
All right. Well, I appreciated getting a chance to revisit the Valiant universe, and I do genuinely want to keep reading that Bloodshot Reborn book and seeing what I think of it. But yeah, it's just nice to it's always nice to kind of see what other people get hyped about. Like, I don't really get people who are super ambivalent about everything, but like if you have something that you're really passionate about, I'm like, yeah, tell me about the thing you're a nerd about, because I understand that impulse. So this is a real treat to get to talk to each other about the things that we're super nerds about. Thank you.
Yeah, likewise. We would encourage you to follow us all on Twitter. You can follow Kara at KaraZam. You can follow me at Death Star Plans. You can follow the show at IRCB Podcast, where we post and share comic news, art, sass, and more. This show and our many subscriber-only episodes are powered by fans like you on Patreon. You can join now at patreon.com/IRCB Podcast. And if you haven't already, please rate and review our show. 5 stars would be great. You can do that at Apple Podcast. You can do that at Spotify. You can do that at Stitcher or anywhere else you listen to podcasts.
Join us on Discord at ircbpodcast.com/Discord, and make sure to tell a friend or two about the show. Infinity Shred is the best. They do our music. Xander is a wizard who also edits the show. Thank you for listening, and until next time, comics are good, and so are you.